Okay, so next up I'm going to ask you some comprehension questions to see how much you remember from lecture 1. All right, so first up, economics is ... Is it A, the study of business and profit making? B, the method of using deductive reasoning to answer sociological questions? C, the study of how interest rates affect unemployment? Or D, the study of production, consumption, and distribution of goods and services? So let's take it one by one. Is it the study of business and profit making? I think I went kind of in depth on this. It's related. We definitely do study businesses in economics. It's, one of the main things that we study, but it's way more expansive than that. And, businesses will factor, particularly in this course where we're looking at microeconomics, they'll factor pretty heavily, but that's not what economics is. It covers a lot more. So I would scrap A. Letter B, the method of using deductive reasoning to answer sociological questions. So your first key here is sociological. Really, sociological questions would be the branch of sociology. However, economics does tend to move into other fields. So that doesn't necessarily push it out completely, but economics is, I wouldn't say more broad than sociology, but it has a different kind of realm than sociology, even if they might overlap. The part that would really eliminate this answer is the method of using deductive reasoning to answer sociological questions. So the deductive reasoning part is where I would focus on, because I showed in the previous lecture that you can use both inductive and deductive reasoning. You could generate your theory from the data, that's deduction, or you can think about a theory and then see if it fits the data. That would be induction. Okay, so you can use both in economics. They're both equally valid. As long as you're eventually driving a theory that makes sense. And for most of economics, I would say if you then test the theory, though there are some economics papers that still reside completely in theory. It's not really the trend where economics is going now, but it's definitely there. Okay, question C, or answer C, the study of how interest rates affect unemployment. Very much an economics question, in particular a macroeconomics question, but that's just one question among millions. So it can't be C, so the answer must be D, the study of production, consumption, and distribution of goods and services. And I went in depth about this definition in the first slide, so I'm not going to cover it any further. Okay. Recap question number 2. Which of the following is a microeconomic question? So, again, let's take it step by step. How do households allocate their income to children? The bell should be ringing. Households is one of the key words that I said to look for when you're thinking about a microeconomic question. So right now, that's my first contender. That's where I would think the answer would be. But let's take a look at the other ones. Who should and should not control the means of production? That is a large question. That is a macro question, I would say, in the sense of the means of production are, I would actually say this is more of a sociology question. This is Marxist to the T, but there's some overlap in economics, again, and production falls in the economics definition. But who should and should not control the means of production is largely a broad question about, who should own the factories. And more than that, it's kind of a normative question, right? We're dealing with shoulds. Economics doesn't really deal with shoulds. They deal with does and is, right? Things that you can answer descriptively. So I would say that this is a normative question. It could fall under sociology, probably falls under philosophy. Sometimes those two can be informed by each other. A lot of sociologists are considered philosophers, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's a micro question. It might even be a macro question if you want to look at it with more of a positive bent. If you want to say, what are the outcomes if we redistribute the means of production to the general populace versus the current status or something like that. But as it stands, it's a normative question, so it's not really even macro in that sense either. Okay, answer C. Why do some countries grow while others stagnate? So this is a large topic. Again, you're dealing with many countries and a large variable, growth. So overall output of the country or overall well-being of the people within a country. That is very much a macro question. You're looking at multiple countries in the large variable, so not a micro question. And then finally, D, why is the price of shares in Google increasing in a bear market? So this can be a micro question if you kind of look at it the right way. But I think this is more of a finance question. It's dealing with, Google stock in a particular market setting. A bear market would be a market like a recession type thing where investors are hesitant to put additional funds into the stock market or into the bond market. Bear market just means that investors are kind of hibernating. That's where it comes from. There's two types of markets: bulls and bears. Bulls are full charge, bears hibernate. But yeah, this is more of a finance question, which, like I said, if you look at it right, could be a micro question, could be an economics question, but it's really, kind of its own thing. So I'd say if I were to make my call, A would be the best guess. How do households allocate their income to their children? You're looking at households, which is, the key indicator that you're dealing with micro question. You can have one budget constraint. You don't have to aggregate it or do anything fancy with it. And then one variable, how does it affecting? How do they allocate their income? So how do we maximize overall utility for the children relative to the income that the household has to spend? Oh, sorry. So A is the correct answer. All right. Next up, question 3. Abstraction is A, a useful way to reduce a model to its key elements. B, an exhaustive list of all the factors behind a model. C, ignoring critical elements of reality to produce a distorted model. Or D, a complete model accounting for every contingency. All right, so let's do the same approach, but I'm going to go D through A just to spice things up, let's say. All right, so D, a complete model accounting for every contingency. What does that mean, first of all? What is contingency? So let's say you're writing up a contract. Contingency means if A happens, then you have something to account for that. If B happens, then you have something to account for that. So if you're accounting for every contingency, there's no stone left unturned. That's not really what abstraction is, right? So if you're looking at inflation, or if you're looking at Card-and-Kruger, unemployment and the minimum wage, to model every contingency, you would say, okay, but what happens if the president says something and that increases national unemployment, but he says something positive about New Jersey, which leaves it stagnant? Or what happens if, all of a sudden New Jersey workers walk out on strike? Or what happens if you have so many of these what happens ifs, and they're not really getting to the heart of the problem, it becomes a completely unanswerable question, because in the real world, it's going to be complex, it's going to be messy, and you can account for that mess, but you're not really accounting for that mess in your model itself. That would be like an after the fact, like, oh, the model didn't really behave the way we expected for certain points here's why, kind of explaining your outlying data, the data that doesn't really fit the rest of the data. So if you're accounting for every contingency in your model, what's going to happen is you're going to have a million equations that you have to solve, and you might only have, 30 data points to 100 data points or whatever. If you're looking at year-over-year unemployment in New Jersey, that's really 10 data points, though, they account for it by looking at individuals. So it becomes a little better, or a lot better, really. But the idea being that if you're accounting for every contingency, the model is completely unsolvable, completely untestable. You can't really do anything with it. You can't say anything meaningful. So your abstractions, you'll need abstractions in order to get away from that. So it can't be D because of accounting for every contingency is too complex. And that's exactly the reason why you need abstractions. Part C, or answer C, ignoring critical elements of reality to produce a distorted model. So this should be a big no-no if you're saying, I'm ignoring things, one, so you shouldn't ignore anything. Even if you're abstracting away from it, you should still have it in the back of your mind. Producing a distorted model, again, that's a negative connotation, right? You don't want to produce a distorted model. No one tries to say, oh, yeah, my model is distorted. Here you go. Publish it. Like, that's just bad. It's just bad form. Like, people might intentionally produce distorted models to get published, but hopefully that gets caught. So no, you don't want to produce a distorted model. You don't want to ignore critical elements of reality. If you do that, you might be abstracting, but you're over abstracting. You're creating, if abstraction is making sure you don't lose the forest for the trees, ignoring critical elements of reality is burning down the whole forest with napalm and saying, where's the forest? So C is wrong. It's hopefully nobody's really seeking out to ignore critical elements and produce distorted models. I hope. All right, letter B, an exhaustive list of all the factors behind a model. So this is really another way of saying D. If it's exhaustive, that means you're accounting for every aspect of possibility, which again is not really what abstraction is. You abstract away from every possible element in order to get only those elements which you really need. All right, so that leaves answer A, a useful way to reduce a model to its key elements. What I mean by that is, you have the complex world of minimum wage unemployment, and you're going to drive through only those factors that really matter. So do demographics matter for minimum wage and unemployment? Do demographics matter for unemployment? Absolutely they do, for better or worse. Do prior wages matter for minimum wage and unemployment? Absolutely they do. Does the number of industries matter? Yes. Does prior output matter? Probably yes. So you take maybe those four things. Does what a particular politician tweeted about New Jersey on a particular day matter? Maybe for that day, probably not for individual businesses in the long run. I doubt it. And if it does, we still will, if it does really matter and we can't really account for it in our model, then we'll write about it in words saying, here's where the model isn't necessarily behaving the way that we expect it to. Here's why. So, you're still abstracting, you're still going to push that away, but you keep it in the back of your mind if your model doesn't behave the way you want it to. But, if the model's across the board not behaving the way you want it to, then you've probably over-abstracted and you probably need to change your assumptions in order to better fit the data. But at the heart of it, yes, abstraction is a useful way to reduce a model to its key elements, and we abstract so that we can say something meaningful about the state of the world, and that we can test the state of the world using statistics and represent it using a model that is solvable.